Good afternoon, everyone. So we are the disaster damage detection team. I'm Andrew, and along with me are Sean, Chris, Tessa, Anne. And then joining us this summer was a data scientist. She's Valentina, and we were all led by Professor Youngjun Choe. So this picture right here is the beautiful downtown Seattle. And Seattle was really our study area for this project over the summer. And before we go deep into what we did for the past 10 weeks, I do want to use this image to offer the first of 2 points of context. The first is I'd like to highlight that this image represents the increasing urbanization we face today in the world. So last year, the World Bank published that about 55% of the population lives in urban city centers similar to downtown Seattle. And whether it's the convenience of just being in a centralized system or the presence of opportunities that draw you to these urban centers, we can't deny the fact that as more and more people centralize, we also increase the complexities of those systems and the support structures we have on board, which essentially means that we have cities now that mostly, maybe not all, but a lot of these cities suffer from one of two things: aging infrastructure that we don't have enough money to keep up because too many people are moving into cities and too many things are going on and we just don't have money to keep rebuilding and keep going. Or two, a lot of cities start to have substandard infrastructure. We just don't have that much resources. And so essentially, that's the problem with the urbanization issue. The second image I'd like to show you is it's the very same beautiful Houston we looked at earlier, but being devastated by Hurricane Harvey in 2017. This is the second point of context I want to bring up. Hurricanes are getting stronger and stronger because we're starting to experience the devastating effects that climate change has brought upon us. And so essentially, we're caught up in this mix, where last year, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, better known as NOAA, indicated that it was the most expensive year for natural disasters. In fact, just because of Hurricanes Harvey and Maria and a few scattered wildfires, that led to about $306 billion being spent on a mix of rehabilitation, rebuilding, and all of these other programs. So we believe it's about time that there's another response to this situation. We believe that there's not enough time or not enough money to keep rebuilding and just building our way out of problems. It's a matter of resilience. How fast can we react? And how can we build systems that make it faster for us to react so we don't have to depend on rebuilding things from scratch? The problem, though, is that the biggest way we respond to natural disasters and status quo is we do one of two things. We manually survey land, and this is known as windshield surveys, where on the right you can see an image of people having to go through cities and act on the ground. And the other is we started developing ways to give quick images, both aerial and satellite, to first responders to try to help their relief efforts. But essentially everything relies on still manual processes, which leads us to this problem. This is Watsonville, and this was the effect after the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. And it's very clear that they were devastated by that earthquake. And yet, at the time, most people didn't know that there was a problem in Watsonville, because the way people responded to crisis at the time was to call in and report damage in their city. Their phone lines were cut. So there was no way to contact the city or the bigger cities and tell them that something was wrong. And that's really the inspiration to all of this, is to try to solve problems like this and work faster. So our solution and the goal that we propose in partnership with Professor Choe's Disaster Data Science Laboratory is to create an automatic damage detection algorithm with the use of machine learning. That way we can help first responders on the ground by trying to automatically flag and point out buildings that may suffer from damages. The goal was also to make it generalizable. This means that in the future, if a new crisis hits, we can feed in similar imagery into the same model and hopefully pick out more buildings that we can try to flag and draw attention to. Essentially, trying to make things faster and also trying to prevent another Watsonville crisis. Now, we don't propose this as an end-all be-all. We want this to be part of the multi-level approach that most disaster teams work on today, where we will have traditional ground level and aerial continue to support the necessary fast response and things like boots on the ground right away, but also try to augment that entire system with satellite imagery and machine learning algorithms to try to help make that response much faster and much more targeted. So to give us more details on what we did this summer, I'd like to pass it on to Sean.
Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful contextualization of why we're doing what we're doing. That is that data science can be used for social good in the sphere of disaster response. So before we dive in further into what we did this summer, I want to give you a roadmap that makes it clear of how we got to this algorithm that we are trying to use for disaster response. Now, the word machine learning, the phrase is machine learning, is often bandied about, and I want to cut through a lot of the techno jargon. I want to give you a way to visualize this of what we did in a clearer way. So when you hear learning, I want you to think of a student, that your machine is the student. So first, we have to have a textbook for the student to learn from, right? There has to be material that they open up and look at, the raw data. Then there has to be a curriculum. The teacher has to teach a certain way. Are they lecturing? Are they a visual learner? There are different ways to teach that material from that textbook. Next, you actually have to sit in the classroom and do it. You know, you always have to go through the hard work. And then finally, we need to test and examine that student to see how well they did, and looking from those scores, maybe repeat it, maybe change something. So first, I'm going to talk about that textbook, creating that training data, something the machine can learn from. So in the context of Hurricane Harvey disaster response, we need to show the computer disaster imagery from after disaster and make sure that imagery is annotated with where those damages are, so it can see what that looks like and hopefully learn some sort of underlying pattern. So first, for aerial imagery, for imagery in general, we first use satellite imagery from Digital Globe, which is a large satellite imagery corporation in Denver, Colorado, and through their open data program for disaster response. The problem with this data, however, not only its incredibly large size, which makes handling a lot, 3 terabytes, it's also missing a lot of data, a bit messy, not really processed quite well. In this case, it's black and white. We wanted color images, right? No one likes black and white. And there are weird artifacts in it, and a lot of time there's a lot of cloud. So when there's cloud cover over it, we can't really see what's going on. So we wanted to create an alternative, or at least find an alternative that we could also use in conjunction with this. So going from satellite imagery, we went to aerial imagery. And so what we did was we looked at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's aerial survey after Hurricane Harvey using their planes. So these go under the cloud cover. So there is a lot less, distortion or mess of what's going on. We have a clearer image. This is downtown Houston, as you've seen before, and you can kind of see where some of the bayous have started to spill the banks. Now, before we go on to the actual damages, we want to point out what makes this unique compared to other remote sensing projects, is that, so you know how your dog can only see certain colors, and you can see way more colors than their dog? There are more colors that we can't see, and there are colors that satellites can pick up that we can't see. However, we don't want to use those extra colors, that extra information. We want to stick to red, green, and blue bands, RGB. Now, why would we want to have less data when we could get more, and near infrared is good for seeing water? Well, in the case of disaster response, getting RGB data is cheaper and faster and usually of higher resolution, which in the case of disaster response is so important to make sure you can get it as fast as possible, especially if we start using aerial imagery, drones and whatnot can only carry so many sensor suites. So next, we wanted to find the actual damage points. It's not good enough just to have the imagery. So first, we relied on TomNod, which is a website owned by Digital Globe. And this is what you call Volunteer Geographic Information Systems, which is a fancy way of saying crowdsource. So you can go on tomnod.com, anyone you can do this. They'll give you a random satellite image and then ask you to annotate it with what you think is a damaged building or not. But as you see from here, what I did, one of those points is not actually a damaged building. So this data is questionable. We used it, but there's some problems with it, some areas that we're not quite certain with. So we wanted to, again, find another alternative. So this time we used data from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. After flood events, they do their own assessment. What's wonderful, as you see here, in the red is FEMA data and the yellow is the TomNod. So we have a lot more data across a larger span of area. And this is, official assessment. The problem still is a lot of this is gathered on the ground, so we're not always sure that this is visible from, aerial or satellite imagery. Many cases, the damage might be internal to the house, or there were only a few inches of flooding, and a lot of it dried out before imagery could be taken. And then finally, we want to make sure that those data points are even more precise, tied to specific buildings, because we're looking for buildings, not just a general area. So first, we used data from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which was contacted right after Hurricane Harvey by FEMA to create these building footprints for a similar reason. And so what's amazing is Oak Ridge was able to use image segmentation, another machine learning algorithm, to create these building footprints within 24 hours. So that's pretty impressive, something we wish we could do. But this data, again, it's a little blobby. That's my technical term for it, blurry, missing points. So we wanted to see if there's something was better out there. And quite recently, Microsoft came out with its own building footprints from their own image segmentation algorithm. And these are much clearer, not perfect. You still have missing gaps. But this is what we use to tie those damage annotations to buildings directly. So up next, Tessa is going to talk about the model selection, the curriculum for the machine.
All right, thank you, Sean. So I'll share a bit of background and some of the pre-existing methods and explain how we decided on 2 models for damage detection. So damage detection can be addressed by using one of several computer vision tasks. So here on the slide, you see a very simple example of 3 such tasks. So the first, classification, which tells you whether a dominant object is or is not present in the image. Here, is there a cat or is there no cat? Segmentation involves dividing the image into regions with common properties. So in the center image, there's a region with cat, sky, trees, and ground. And then object detection can identify and locate multiple objects in a given image with a bounding box around it. So here, a number of animals are detected and located on the right. And a more advanced task you're probably exposed to daily is facial recognition in images on social media. So then how do these tasks apply to satellite imagery? First, classification. The image would be classified as a building, for example, but it wouldn't capture the presence of multiple buildings or the presence of flooded and non-flooded buildings in the same image. Segmentation, you can see the center image is a pre-existing application where it was used to detect flooded roads in satellite imagery, so whether they're flooded roads or just background. And then object detection, which is the computer vision task we decided to use for this project for a number of reasons. First, it accounts for some of the limitations that classification and segmentation have for our application, because it can detect several flooded buildings and non-flooded buildings in a given image, and it shows more detail than segmentation can. Secondly, it has the possibility to detect different object classes that may be of interest to emergency managers. So that would include degrees of damaged buildings, damaged bridges and roads, and damaged debris, et cetera. And lastly, object detection would allow the model to be more generalizable, since it can be trained to detect features such as landslides that would be of more relevant in different contexts or for different types of disasters. So on this slide, you can see some sample output. On the left, you can see TOMNA damage predictions with confidence scores. And on the right, you can see NOAA damage predictions. So there are a number of object detection methods that have been developed. However, we mainly considered faster RCNN and SSD, which are both state-of-the-art methods using deep learning. And given our timeline, we decided on SSD, the SSD model, since it was pre-trained with 60 object classes at the XView detection challenge. But this pre-trained model did not include flooded feature classes, which would be our contribution. And faster RCNN and SSD both predict bounding boxes and confidence scores for different objects that they've been trained to detect. So once we had selected our models, we developed our pipeline. And in the pipeline, essentially, we start with raw data, which we pass through a series of processes, including image tiling, where we reduced the image from 3 terabytes to 60 gigabytes, and then passed it to data processing and model training and inference. And if you want more details on that process, it's available on our website. Now that we have our textbook and curriculum selected, Ann and Chris will explain more details about the model implementation part.
Thanks, Tessa. So I'll just talk a little bit about how we implemented our model. So first of all, we have our data, satellite imagery and aerial imagery. And we have bounding boxes for them, and each bounding box is associated with a label indicating whether this building is damaged or not. We are facing one problem, is the size of the satellite imagery is too large for neural network to train. We got to chip it into smaller size. We tried different sizes and found that 200 by 200 is is the best size for us. And then we face another problem is that we don't have enough training data. We have like 10K top-notch adapted building training points. And we decided that if we want to go with neural network, we got to make it a larger training data set. And there's a commonly used trick called data augmentation that helps us to do this. So one image can be shifted, it can be rotated, and it can be blurred so that we can pretend that we have a lot more images. So through this trick, we are able to enlarge our training data size. And last but not least, we train our models on GPU machines on AWS, and our implementation is with TensorFlow. So next, Chris is going to talk more about the alternatives we have running the model.
Thanks, Anne. So this slide basically just gives a sense at the scale at which the number of options and combinations at which we could combine different parameters and data together to form different model runs really is. And so we can change the architecture, we can use different imagery data sets, different damage data, building footprints, all of which we've discussed. We can join those data sets in different ways, and we can also do the testing and training with different subsets of the data that we have. We can also tune the model hyperparameters, and all those things are going to give us a different model run in the end, and will give us a set of all different alternatives. So what we do is we elect 3 different combinations of these. And before we present model results, we'd like to talk a bit about how those results are evaluated and give us our final numbers. So essentially, we use IOU, which is intersection over union. It's one aspect of a lot of evaluation algorithms to determine if your object detection is performing well. Basically, the stronger models will have higher overlap between the predictions, which are shown by the red bounding boxes here, with the green bounding box here, which would be your training data. So if there's higher overlap, that means that your model is focusing better on what the actual data is. So in this picture, we have the pink boxes, which represent our training data, which is human labeled in this case. And then let's assume that the green and red boxes are predictions from our model. And we can see that the IOU is less than a threshold, 50% for the red box in the top left-hand corner, while in the green box, there's definitely a higher than 50% overlap with the purple box. So in this case, our model will be evaluated to having a higher score due to the green prediction, but not the red prediction here. And so if we assume that each of these circles here are buildings in our data set, let's imagine that the green ones are damaged buildings and that the red and orange ones are not damaged buildings. Our model is going to predict a subset of these, and depending on what that subset is and the relative numbers between them, we will get different scores for precision and recall, with precision being basically how well our model is predicting if it does predict something, and then recall being of all the things that we want to predict, how many of those are we getting? And we combine those into an average precision, and basically that will give us a number between 1 and 0, and 1 is going to be meaning that your model is performing very well, and 0 would be a useless model. So we want to get somewhere higher than that. So next, Anne's going to talk about the results.
I would like to thank Chris for explaining the hard part. So now I will present our, before I present our final result on model, I want to say something about how we arrived where we are today. So our main goal is to push average precision for damaged buildings. So initially we tried creating bounding boxes around only the damaged buildings and use that to train a neural network. It didn't work very well. As you can see, it's like 0.05. And we then thought that maybe adding more data will help. That data came from non-damaged buildings. There are also buildings that may help us to predict maybe damaged buildings as well. And it turned out to be very helpful. Adding that, we right now achieved 0.33, which is not bad. And then by adding the non-damaged buildings, we have the class imbalance problem because there are a lot more good buildings than the bad ones. Then we applied augmentation. Then finally you arrive at our current solution of current result, which is 0.47. And this is our final result. We achieved our best runs on satellite imagery with SSD. For flooded buildings, we achieved average precision of 0.47. For non-damaged buildings, it's 0.62. So I'm going to show you some visualization of this best model. So in this slide on the left-hand side, you can see the ground truth, which is the human labor data. Number one denotes, yeah, this is a damaged building. And right-hand side is our model prediction. The green bounding boxes are the predictions. So you can see that our model is able to pick up damaged buildings and the bounding boxes are reasonable. And what's more, so among all of the tons of like non-damaged buildings, as you can see on the right-hand side, denoted by blue buildings, our model is able to pick up the single one damaged building, which indicated by the green bounding boxes. So it's saying that the model is able to pick up some signals to identify the bad buildings from the non-damaged buildings. So and also, except for besides flooded buildings, our model is able to detect damaged buildings, maybe wind damage or roof damage or some just damage from the appearance that the people, human eyes can see. So in this case, there are two damaged buildings in the top left corner. Maybe you can see from this slide, there is a blue top on top of the building. So we think that the model is able to pick up that as a signal saying that this is a damaged building. And this is another example showing how the model is capable of picking up damaged buildings. So the green bounding box covers a building that with maybe roof damage clearly that we are, as human, we can tell from the images. So that's all for the results. Andrew is going to wrap up.
So this is essentially the schema that we looked at this entire day. And I'd just like to go through some things that we've, just a general overview and things moving forward. And the first would be for creating training data. As what Sean mentioned, it was a pretty hefty task, and we're happy to say that we will be releasing the final data set that we used to train as a public database with a geo server. So you can check the website later on. We want to publish this data so more people can do research on it and so that we can continue to do different models and try different things. For model selection, you can see more information on our GitHub page, which will also be linked on the website. And we also hope that more people try different curriculum, as what we like to call it, or more importantly, just different models on the data we're releasing, so we can try more interesting things with this. Next, model implementation, we only applied it in Harvey, and we're hoping that more people try to look into the instances and cases of Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma, which devastated Puerto Rico and Florida as well. And we'd see if that model will perform in those cases. And lastly, the model is not perfect, but we see very good and clear signs of hope that there are features and artifacts that the model can pick out. And going back to the inspiration of this project, Watsonville was an area that just didn't have information on it. And adding this other layer to the entire scheme of how we respond to disaster is hopefully just one more contribution we can add to hopefully preventing another Watsonville crisis from happening. So to end, we'd like to thank, oops, I'm sorry, that's odd. But to end, I would like to thank all the sponsors who really helped make this project possible. We'd like to thank the eScience Institute, That's odd. We'd like to thank eScience Institute and all of the sponsors as well that put in their efforts and put in their unwavering support. And without you guys, we would not have been able to do the work we did this summer. So again, thank you again. That's it.
Do you guys all want to come over and you can take some questions? We have time for a couple questions from the audience. I'll let you guys choose.
So there were NOAA and Tom9 models that were doing similar tasks of identifying damaged buildings. How does your model compare in terms of absolute success rate or false positives, false negatives? Because exactly, I see the number, but I can't be sure how that compares with other existing models that you were comparing.
So yeah, most of it was just a comparison between like the performance of the models we tested, not really of other existing models. Because in terms of object detection, we didn't see much in the literature in terms of trying to detect like damaged buildings per se. What was very common was like flood modeling and trying to detect where like what regions were damaged by floods. So in this case, we look like the metric that's used is sort of a mix of if it's detecting it properly and also if the bounding box is marked properly. So it's kind of like a in the middle sort of metric. It's not very common also to do a whole false positive, false negative, because it's kind of hard to determine given that in object detection, any portion of the image can be counted as an object. So it's kind of hard to figure out like of the subset, how many was wrongly detected and stuff like that. So the metric is more of like, of the things it detects, how precise is it? And this was the comparison table that we had for that.
So once you built your data set, how big was it and how long did it take you to run the model?
So the imagery from Digital Globe in total was about 3 terabytes. It had to be highly filtered because of a lot of artifacts and corrupted data. And to make it more handleable, we did compress it down to 60 gigabytes. The NOAA data, when we first brought it, was about, I think, a half a terabyte, and we brought that down similarly to much smaller, to I think also 50 gigabytes. With the downgrade compression, there actually wasn't a great deal of loss in terms of fidelity that would make a difference for us. That's what we call raster data, the imagery. The other data we call vector data. Even then, with the building footprints, those come into the gigabytes, which when you try to run through things like on a GIS system can be a little stressful, but it's not as bad as the imagery. So it did take a while to sort of clean those up and put it in a way that people could use finally. And then Anne could probably talk more, but we did have to play with things like spot instances on ADOS because it would run for a while, for days.
Thank you for your question. We did some post-processing to the data, like remove the clouds and the black images. And then we have we have like 10K damaged buildings and 10 times more non-damaged buildings. And we chose a small network called Inception V2S base network for SSD model. So it took us 24 hours or so to finish training. That's when we see the model converges. So 24 hours.
So you use GPUs, right?
Yes.
How many GPUs?
Just a single GPU machine. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Sorry. Also, we just want to flag that the final data set was about 60 to 50, depending on which data set we're looking at, 50 to 60 gigabytes. But when we trimmed it down to the region where there were annotations, it came down to close to about 10 gigabytes. So it was a bit easier for the model to pick up at that point in time. But there are some other stuff you can do with the extra 40 if you'd like to experiment also.
And how much did it cost you?
Well, the regular rates for GPUs is like 90 cents an hour. But when we did our last few runs, we got to figure out how to play with spot instances. And right now, the going rate for spot instances is like 0.27, about 27 cents. So it was like a third of what we were spending at first. Yeah.
I think we'll wrap up there, but please, if you have more more questions, come and talk to the fellows after or join us at the reception. Let's give them one more round of applause.